Did he leave his blind son sitting out in the snow just for a Zoom call with foreign investors? That sentence still echoed in Ava's mind as she rushed out into the freezing winter night, pulling the poor boy into her small restaurant. She wasn't a hero, she was just an exhausted woman, 3 months behind on rent, with an ailing mother dying in a nursing home. But the moment she touched the trembling hand of that boy, she knew her life would never be the same again. Before diving into a story that will keep you glued to the screen, I have a small request. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you love inspiring stories, and don't forget to leave a comment letting me know. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you live? It always feels amazing to see the whole world come together just to share a meaningful moment.
Welcome to 30 Millionaire Stories, where success meets solitude, and every story heals a hidden wound. Subscribe and discover the heart behind the fortune.
Brandon Keller was once a name mentioned in every major tech magazine in America. The man behind a streaming platform that changed the way people enjoyed music, movies, and even how they made a living. But behind the spotlight and sensational headlines was a harsh reality. Brandon never knew how to hold on to happiness. After the accident that took his wife 4 years ago, Brandon stopped appearing in public. He vanished from social media, cut off contact with the press, quietly stepped down from his executive role, and retreated to live in a sprawling mansion hidden among the cold, gray pine forests in the suburbs of Seattle. The house was too vast, too silent, and too cold for the number of people actually living in it. Only two remained, Brandon and his son, Jonah, a 6-year-old boy who developed selective mutism after the accident. He didn't speak to anyone, didn't respond, didn't cry, didn't smile. His world had been sealed shut the moment the ambulance carried his mother's body away from the scene that year. Brandon had been at the hospital, but all that remained was a death certificate and the panicked eyes of a child who couldn't understand why his mother wasn't coming back. From that day on, Brandon was no longer himself. He stopped attending meetings, stopped giving speeches, stopped communicating, even stopped eating meals with his son. The company kept running, but his name existed only on paper. In the mansion spanning thousands of square feet, he spent most of his time in the old library, rereading books with no endings, or sitting for hours in front of a computer screen without typing a single word. Sometimes he wondered what he was waiting for: a miracle, an apology from fate, or just a reason to start over, one that never came. He hired the best therapists, brought in child psychologists from the East Coast to the West, equipped a private classroom with sensory toys, therapeutic sounds, soft lighting, and cutting-edge language support devices. Each expert came and went, leaving behind repetitive assessments. Jonah needs time, Jonah needs patience, Jonah needs love. But no one showed Brandon how to give those things, because in his heart, love had become a dangerous thing, something that could be taken away in an instant, without warning, without a sign. Brandon thought he had done enough. He chose the best school for his son, ensured he had private classes, a driver for pickup and drop-off, and someone on call 24/7. The boy was protected by every standard a child could have, but not once did Brandon step into his son's room without a reason. Not once did he tell a bedtime story. Not once did he ask how his son felt that day. It wasn't because he didn't care, but because every time he stood before Jonah's empty gaze, he felt suffocated. Guilt rose like a tide, drowning every effort. He told himself, as long as he's well cared for, that's enough. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. No school, no therapy, no doctor could replace a hug. Jonah didn't blame him. He couldn't. But the boy's silence was the harshest indictment life had ever handed down to him. And every day that passed, Brandon sat there facing the cold wooden wall, thinking of the woman who once warmed this house with her laughter, and the child who now lived beside him like a shadow in his own home. Decatur grew dark earlier than usual that evening. The rain wasn't heavy, but it fell steadily, cold and persistent. On the small street with the peeling paint diner, A black SUV pulled up in silence. Brandon Keller sat in the back seat reviewing documents. He was on his way to a discreet meeting with new developers, a promising project he didn't want his name attached to. No media, no assistant, no Jonah. He glanced back at his son, then silently nodded to the driver. 5 minutes, he thought, he'll be fine. But he didn't ask if his son was okay, nor did he realize that the 6-year-old had never been taught how to wait. Inside the car, Jonah sat upright, hands resting on his thighs. No screen, no toys, no words, only the soft patter of rain against the window. The boy reached up to touch the button on his coat, then quietly unlatched the door without anyone noticing. When he stepped out, he didn't run, didn't look around, didn't make a sound. He just walked a few steps and sat down on the cold, wet steps in front of the diner, where the faint yellow light spilled out from inside. The wind was gentle, the rain grew heavier. Jonah tilted his face upward, letting the cold droplets fall on his cheeks. His coat soaked through, his shoes began to squish, but he didn't shiver, didn't resist. He just sat there, as if waiting for someone he wasn't sure still existed. Inside the diner, Eliza was cleaning the kitchen floor after her shift. She worked the night shift, a side job few wanted, low pay, a cold kitchen, leftover food, and the constant hum of the exhaust fan. Today, she was running late because she'd gone back to the hospital to check on her mother's test results, the woman who hadn't recognized her own daughter for a month. Eliza had nothing but a pair of worn-out rubber shoes and a habit, always looking around before taking out the trash. She opened the back door and saw Jonah. At first, she thought it was a reflection, but as she stepped closer, she realized it was a boy sitting in the rain, his back hunched, hands limp, eyes unblinking. No one beside him, no car, no adults, no calls. A child, silent to an unsettling degree. Eliza approached slowly, kneeling on the wet steps. She didn't ask anything, didn't shout. She simply took the small cloth from her apron and draped it over his head. She touched his hand, ice cold, like stone. But the boy didn't flinch, didn't resist. He let her take his hand and led him inside as if they'd known each other for a long time. She sat him near the kitchen, removed his soaked socks, placed a dried towel over his shoulders. No explanations. No one needed to ask where he came from. Just Eliza, the last bowl of hot soup left from dinner, and a small spoon, moving slowly. When the third spoonful touched his lips, she saw something she wasn't sure was real. A smile. Not clear, not radiant, just a faint curve, fleeting like a breath, but a smile. The door swung open at that moment. Brandon rushed in, his face panicked from not finding his son in the car. He pushed past the crowd, then froze when he saw his son sitting there. His gaze softened, his lips still wet with soup, and a strange woman wiping his forehead with an old cloth. Jonah didn't look at his father. He only turned to Eliza, and for the first time since the accident, his eyes were no longer lost. 2 days had passed since that rainy night, but Eliza couldn't shake the image of the boy sitting on the diner steps, his pale face, soaked clothes, and vast, anchorless eyes. She didn't know who he was, nor did she ask. Everything happened so quickly that when the man in the dark coat rushed in, his eyes stunned before he swept the child into his arms. Eliza only stepped back and gave a slight nod, as if apologizing for intruding on something that wasn't hers. She thought that was the end of it. But on Friday morning, while wiping down the kitchen counter, the diner manager called her outside with an odd expression. Someone was waiting, he said. A man had asked for her by name, very politely, but gave no reason for his visit. Eliza stepped out, still holding her cleaning rag, and immediately recognized the man from that night. The same dark coat, the same cautious posture, but this time his eyes weren't panicked. They were pensive. He didn't introduce himself, didn't mention the rainy night. He only said that a major tech company in Seattle was opening a position in their internal communications department, and he believed she would be a good fit. Eliza was momentarily stunned. She had never worked in an office, no degree, no communications experience. But the man didn't talk about skills. He spoke of kindness, that the company needed people who knew how to listen, how to observe, and who wouldn't turn away when someone needed to be seen. She didn't ask further questions. She just thanked him, half doubtful, half bewildered. But 2 days later, an official offer letter arrived in her temporary email inbox, accompanied by a plane ticket, temporary accommodation, and a 3-month probationary contract. Everything was too precise to be a mistake. Eliza left Decatur one early morning, carrying an old suitcase, her mind still looping with unanswered questions. Why her? Why would an unknown woman with no resume, no experience, be chosen? But as she stepped into the glass building where the company was headquartered, she began to understand. It wasn't because she was special. It was because something special had happened with a child, and someone had seen it. In her first days in the communications department, Eliza quietly learned. Everything was new. Processes, terminology, work emails, report spreadsheets. But she wasn't intimidated. She wrote concisely, clearly, authentically, and there was something in her choice of words that made every internal newsletter feel more approachable. She had a way of touching readers' emotions, not through skill, but through raw sincerity. The manager assigned to guide her was a poised, strict, but fair woman. Eliza learned quickly. She was always the first to arrive, the last to leave, taking meticulous notes, listening more than speaking. And in the quiet moments between work hours, she often felt a gaze watching from a distance, not monitoring, but a silent protection. The small apartment arranged for her wasn't far from the office, but what surprised Eliza was that it was close to a quiet residential area, where after just a few days, she realized it was Brandon Keller's neighborhood. She didn't ask why, but every evening on her way home, when she caught sight of the black SUV parked in front of the garage, or saw Jonah sitting quietly on the wooden bench by the front porch, she understood that the connection between them wasn't just about one rainy night. It had become something quieter, a bond undefined, unbound, but real. Jonah began to grow accustomed to her presence. He didn't speak, didn't show emotion, but his eyes were no longer distant. He let her read to him, let her sit beside him while he drew, let her warm him with a patience no one had taught her how to give. And Brandon, he still maintained a silence like a boundary, but Eliza understood. Some doors, once open, could never be closed the same way again. Dear audience, take a moment to relax or grab a glass of water, then keep listening to the story. There are still surprising developments ahead. Comment 1 if you're enjoying the story so we know you're still with us. Not everyone in that glass building welcomed Eliza. Though she worked quietly, without fanfare, and never meddled in anything that wasn't her place, there were still nameless glances that followed her every time she entered a room. Among them, one stood out above the rest, colder, sharper, coming from a woman named Chelsea. Chelsea was no ordinary employee. She was Brandon's longtime personal assistant, with him since the company's earliest days. She knew his meeting schedules, his tastes, even the way he furrowed his brow when displeased. But what Chelsea never had was the closeness Eliza had inadvertently touched. Not through strategy, not through effort, but through a single rainy night. Chelsea noticed Brandon's gaze lingering longer when Eliza walked in. She observed subtle shifts in his routine, meetings ending earlier, stops at the residential area where Eliza lived, and she realized something she couldn't accept. Eliza was a nobody, with no degree, no background, yet she was standing in a place Chelsea had once thought was hers. She began to watch silently. She combed through Eliza's internal emails, noted her writing style, saved every smallest attachment. And then, Chelsea did something unthinkable. She used her privileged access to remotely log into the system, created a new email under Eliza's name, and sent a confidential file related to a potential collaboration with Netflix. When the leak was discovered, no one suspected Eliza would be the one named. On a Monday morning, she was summoned to an urgent meeting with the executive board. The room was stark white, filled with unfamiliar faces, stern gazes, and a color printout on the table listing an email address, a timestamp, an electronic signature, all pointing to her. Eliza froze. She had never opened that document. She didn't even know it existed. But sometimes truth isn't determined by who's right. It's determined by who holds the evidence. Brandon was in the room. He sat silently, his eyes not meeting hers directly. When Eliza looked up, she caught his gaze, not angry, not disappointed, but quiet, as if weighing something beyond the realm of reason. He said he believed her, but she understood that in his heart, there was a void larger than trust. His responsibility to the company, the expectations of the board, the reputation he had built over years. Though unspoken, Eliza knew she had become a crack in that perfect image. And that crack was spreading. By the hour, she was asked to take a temporary leave while the investigation continued. Not fired, but barred from accessing any internal systems. It was an informal suspension, just enough to hurt, but not enough to fight back. Eliza left the building that day with heavy steps. She didn't think about her honor or her job. She thought about Jonah and the look in his eyes when she no longer stopped by at the end of the day, no longer read to him, no longer held his hand across the lawn to the bench by the porch. That boy didn't speak, but Eliza knew some absences weighed heavier than any refusal. And what hurt her most was that she couldn't explain to him that she wasn't leaving by choice, but because someone had never accepted her presence here. Brandon had never let himself lose control, but this time he didn't sleep for 3 nights. Not out of anger, but because of a wrenching feeling in his chest that he couldn't name. The silence of Eliza before the board, her face neither pleading nor defiant, made him feel as if he were losing something fragile yet real. No one in the company understood why he was so determined to keep a new employee at such a critical moment. But for Brandon, it wasn't about emotions, it was about the truth. And he needed to find it, no matter what. He summoned the IT team to work through the night. Every line of code, every login session, every IP address was combed through like sifting metal fragments from ashes. Brandon didn't rest, didn't eat, just sat before the screen, eyes fixed on the endless stream of characters. Until a red line appeared. A foreign device, not Eliza's, not registered in the system, had accessed her internal account at 8:14 p.m. and on the night of the incident. In just 7 minutes, the email containing the Netflix file was sent, and then the device vanished from the system as if it had never existed. Brandon stared at the data for a long time, and when the security team traced the device's address to Chelsea's admin account, the only one with access to the HR interface, he said nothing. Didn't sigh, he simply stood up, pulled out his phone, and ordered preparations for an internal press conference. Eliza needed to be cleared, not just to protect her honor, but to mend something within himself. But then, something no one could have foreseen happened. That morning, during Jonah's weekly language therapy session, he was asked to play a simple game. Pick 3 cards with faces that match the emotions of people in his life. The boy didn't choose anything, didn't react. He only held a card with a smiling face and stared at it for a long time. The therapist didn't push, but when she mentioned Eliza's name, something stirred in him. Jonah looked up. His dark eyes blinked softly. A silence stretched across the room like still water waiting for a stone to drop. And then, like a taut string suddenly released, he opened his mouth. His voice was very small, not fully formed, but clear. Eliza didn't do anything wrong. The therapist froze, and the assistant behind her nearly dropped her pen. He continued, still in that same quiet tone, as if afraid to break the familiar stillness around him. She is good. She doesn't lie. She's like Mom. One sentence, 3 years of silence, shattered. The news reached Brandon before the press conference began. He stood motionless in the office hallway, phone pressed to his ear, his heart seeming to stop for a moment. He didn't hear the rest of the call. All he could hear was his son's voice, the child he thought he could never reach, defending the only woman besides his mother who made him feel safe. He hung up, and for the first time in a long while he felt his eyes grow wet, not because of victory, but because a small door in Jonah had opened. Not through medicine, not through therapy, but through trust. Built in quiet afternoons, spoonfuls of hot soup, and a pair of hands that promised nothing but always stayed. Chelsea left the glass building on a lightly rainy morning. No one saw her off, no one said goodbye. She walked through the hallway that once belonged to her steps quick but cold. What she lost wasn't just her job, but something she never truly had: trust. Meanwhile, Eliza was reinstated. But what was even more surprising was an invitation from the board itself, a new role. Head of culture and inspiration, a position that had never existed before. No one could deny her influence, not through speeches, but through a gentle presence that softened the sharp edges, the dryness, the mechanical nature of the office. The emails she wrote were no longer just internal communications. They were the heartbeat of the entire company. Brandon didn't say much. He remained as he always was, quiet, punctual, reserved. But since the day Jonah spoke Eliza's name, something had shifted. Every evening, he drove to the small apartment by the cherry tree street, walking with Eliza and Jonah through the park, along the lake, down paths strewn with spring flower petals. Quiet dinners for three became an unspoken routine. No one demanded it, no one scheduled it. But on nights it didn't happen, the house felt empty. Jonah liked to sit in the middle, one hand holding Brandon's, the other holding Eliza's. He didn't speak much, but sometimes his eyes sparkled when Eliza poured water, when Brandon pulled out a chair, when both of them laughed over something small and tender. One early April night, as the cherry blossoms touched like soft clouds, the three sat on a wooden bench near an old fountain. A gentle breeze blew. The yellow streetlights cast reflections on the lake like stray beams of sunlight. Jonah sat quietly on the bench, his head resting on Eliza's shoulder. His small hand was warm. Eliza wrapped her arm around his shoulder, as if she had done so for years. Then in the gentle silence of the night, Jonah looked up, his eyes studying Eliza as if weighing something deeply important. "If you were my mom," he said softly, "would she smile like that?" The question fell lightly, like a petal, fragile but impossible to ignore. Brandon froze. He turned, looking at Eliza. No words were prepared, no script existed for this moment. Just three people, a father with a once frozen heart, a woman who never thought she'd belong anywhere, and a child learning to trust and love again. Eliza didn't shy away. She didn't laugh loudly or gush with emotion. She just looked at Jonah, gave a gentle nod, and hugged him tightly, as if he had just spoken the most sacred thing his heart had kept hidden. Brandon watched them, a hug, an acceptance, a quiet peace, something in his chest softened. He no longer wanted to analyze, no longer feared being wrong, no longer avoided the questions he'd never dared to ask. He turned to her, his voice low and rough, as if each word had traveled a long road to be spoken. "If I asked," he paused, his eyes still fixed on the scene before him, "would you be willing to step into our lives?" Eliza looked up, not a second of hesitation. She nodded. No wedding dress, no diamond ring, no grand vows, just a nod, a smile, and a child who had found a place to call home. Perhaps the most magical thing in life doesn't come from grand plans, but from a small act, like a woman kneeling in the rain to wipe a stranger's child's face. Eliza wasn't rich, wasn't powerful, wasn't remarkable, but she had something the world needs more than ever: unconditional kindness. And Brandon, the man who once had everything, yet lost his way because he didn't know how to love, found his heart again, not through control, but by learning to let someone in. This story reminds us that sometimes family doesn't begin with blood, but with presence, care, and the courage to stay when others turn away. If this story touched you, leave a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been healed by a stranger? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with those you love. Who knows, someone out there might need this to start over. Thank you for watching until the end. See you in the next story.